now. I'm Carl Franklin in Connecticut in the United States, and I've just recently started a ketogenic diet to take control of my metabolism.
Hi, I'm Richard Morris in Canberra, Australia. I've been on a ketogenic diet now since April 2014. When I started, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. Within 6 months of starting a ketogenic diet, all my biomarkers of disease had disappeared.
I also have type 2 diabetes, and we're going to share the progress of my journey through ketosis and Richard's experience thriving for years in ketosis, and hopefully that might help a few people who are curious about this kind of dietary hacking.
Yeah, we're not doctors, and we don't want to give anyone any specific medical advice, but we are keen to share our own experiences. We're actually both software developers, so we're not afraid of a little technical detail. We've done some research into our own deranged metabolisms and the science behind them, and we hope to share some of that research. Where possible, we intend to put links in the show notes to cite the research supporting any claims that we make.
You'll probably work out pretty quickly that we're both foodies. And we're going to share some of the great food that we can eat on this diet. In every episode, both of us will share a recipe for an essential keto meal that we eat regularly. So, let's start podcast number 4, The Big Fat Show. So, Richard, do we have any corrections or apologies from last week?
Sure. I mentioned a Scotsman who holds the Guinness World Record for the longest fast. I said that he fasted for 250 days. Mm-hmm. That was technically true.
Okay.
He did fast for 250 days, and then without eating anything else, he kept going for another 132 days, making the world record a total of 382 days.
And is he now the world's smallest man?
Yeah.
How does one do that? So he basically lived on his own fat stores for more than a year.
More than a year. He walked in very obese and he said, look, I intend to do this. I intend to not eat. And for as long as you tell me that I'm in medically sound territory, and I just want you to keep track of me. And he'd come on a regular basis to get blood draws and to have biomarkers tested. And he made it for 382 days and apparently never put the weight back on again.
Well, let me tell you where I'm at, and then I'd like to know where you are. I know that you've been exercising and fasting. I have not been exercising or fasting, and I've been on a plateau here roughly around the same weight, maybe dropping a couple of pounds a week, something like that, for 2 weeks now. We looked this up. Apparently, it's a thing.
Yeah.
It's called PISS, and that's an acronym, so don't write letters. It's an acronym that stands for Post Induction Stall Syndrome. And this came out of the Atkins world, right?
Right. Because
induction is their first 2-week or 4-week diet that's pretty straight. It's basically the ketogenic diet for 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And everybody goes through this phase, and apparently it's a thing. So what they say is that after your body sort of adjusts to burning fat, and you lose a lot of water weight immediately. And as we have mentioned before, that's the glycogen reserves that we have in there.
Yeah.
They're 3/4 water. Mm-hmm. After you lose that, your body sort of adjusts to the water and salt and all of that stuff, and you slowly bring on more water weight. At the same time, you're burning fat. People might see a plateau, and they might even see a bump, and they might even see like a little rise in weight over, it could be a 3 or 4 week period. It could be 6 weeks.
Right.
6 weeks is where they say, okay, now if you haven't broken it in 6 weeks, you might need to intervene with some intermittent fasting or some more exercise or that kind of thing, or just watch the hidden carbs. But pretty much it works itself out after a maximum of 6 weeks.
So you really have to, at that point, after 6 weeks of not losing, you have to then start tracking everything you eat, because it's possible that you're getting carbohydrates that you're not aware of, and that's forcing your natural appetite to eat more.
Yep. So I'm just going to stick it out. I still feel great, and I'm actually losing inches. So I noticed that While the scale is telling me I'm of the same weight, probably more of that is getting converted into muscle. As we know, muscle is heavier than fat.
It is, yeah. The most important area to measure yourself is right around your belly button, because that's where all your visceral fat is. So, as I mentioned last week, for the 18 months that I was on the plateau, I lost about 8 inches around my visceral section. So that was a significant difference for me.
So I'm completely happy with this, and I'm just going to wait it out, and that's what they say to do, and that's what I'm planning on doing. So what happened with you? I mean, I can see in your face, we're looking at each other via Skype, and I can see in your face you look even thinner than you did before.
Yeah, thanks. I've lost about 2.5 kilos just of water today. I did a 36-kilometre bike ride. Now, I've started doing these longer bike rides on a Sunday about the same time that we started the podcast. So, and I'm doing it because I just feel like getting out and doing something over the weekend, and I feel great afterwards. And the primary reason for doing it is not to add a calorie deficit, but to do something to drive down my insulin. So I've been doing that now for 3-4 weeks. Last week I did 2 laps around the lake in the middle of Canberra. This week I did 1 lap around the lake, and that was 36 kilometres, and I think that's probably what I'm going to end up doing most weekends. So
great.
Yeah, so I'm off my plateau and I'm feeling great.
That's awesome. We're on iTunes now. We've arrived. And I'm no stranger to podcasts. I had one of the first podcasts ever, actually, called .NET Rocks.
Yeah.
Still have it. Yeah. It's for programmers. But anyway, we're 2 keto dudes. And I actually, on my iPhone, I use a program called RSS Radio instead of iTunes. I try to stay away from iTunes, and it's not because of anything I'm worried about. It just feels like so much overhead with updating all the time, and I don't like the interface, and they lock you into all this stuff. I just don't use it. So
I detest the interface of iTunes.
Yeah, it's terrible.
People have for many years have been telling me that Apple know about user interfaces, and I just say, have you seen iTunes?
Yeah, except for that.
Yeah, except for that.
Yeah, they're good on the phone, but
I've got an Android and I use Pocket Casts, and that does a good job for me. In fact, it's actually an Australian product, but it's well known worldwide.
So the reason we wanted to be on iTunes is because once you get in that list, then all of the other podcast apps sort of pick up your feed.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And that's why we're there. All right, we've got some good feedback also on the show. Just a couple of minutes to acknowledge the people who have sent in kudos to us, and we have comment sections on the website, which we hope people will use. We also belong to a closed Facebook group called Keto Ninjas, which is a lot of fun. There's a lot of Australians on that.
There is a few. I think it's partly my fault. No, they're mostly. It started out being Americans. I think I might have been the only Australian, and then
all right,
and then I just told the Aussies. But thanks for the feedback, everybody. Well, I'm going to try and dial down the science a bit now that we've covered off some big topics that we needed to get through. The feedback was great. Some of it, people said, "Oh, that sounds like going to a science lecture." So I apologise for that. I'll dial that back a bit.
Well, we said it. So if you want the hardcore science, really the first 3 episodes are what that's all about. Yeah.
Pretty much.
So let's talk about fat.
Let's do a big fat show.
When I tell people how much fat I eat, they're horrified. When they see me putting salt and butter, melting butter on my steak in a restaurant, people look at me like, well, that's why he's fat. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's just the opposite. People just don't understand.
Yeah. This is how see, the thing is that fat is a fuel, but it's a fuel just like glucose and protein, but it's about twice as dense as any other fuel. So one of the reasons that we've had this fat phobia for many years is if you take 100 grams of carbohydrate, let's say a block of sugar, 100 grams worth of sugar, and you take 100 grams of fat, like 100 mils of olive oil, for example, that olive oil is going to have twice the energy of the sugar, gram for gram. So people think, if you eat fat, then you're going to obviously put it on. And the problem is, of course, that people don't understand the fundamental biochemistry.
And it's true that you will put it on if you're eating carbohydrates. If you're eating more than 20 grams of carbohydrates or whatever the magic number is for you, yes, the fat you eat goes right to where you. And it's my question is, if you eat carbohydrates and you're above the ketosis level, right? So you're burning glucose for fuel. And then you eat, let's say a tablespoon of butter or something like that. Does that butter go right to your thighs? Or does the sugar that you eat get converted into fat that goes to your thighs? Like, how does that happen?
Sure. So what happens is when you eat some sugar, your body recognizes that your sugar levels are going up and it creates some insulin because it wants to utilize all that sugar.
Yep.
And that insulin locks all of the fat off into, it basically says, right, from now on, we're burning all of our glucose and, all of the fat we're going to shuffle into fat cells for storage.
So it is true that the tablespoon of butter gets stored directly.
Yeah.
So basically they're right about, when you eat fat, you get fat if you have carbohydrates.
Exactly. If you have enough carbohydrates for your energy requirements and you eat some fat as well, that is exactly the story. Now, the interesting thing is when you don't eat the carbohydrates, you don't have very much carbohydrate, your body is forced to predominantly fuel on fat. Mm-hmm. And as long as you don't eat a lot of carbohydrate, your body is quite happy liberating the fat out of your fat stores that you've stored, maybe a decade ago you ate a Krispy Kreme, a decade ago and you didn't need to burn it immediately. It's now stored as body fat. You can then access that from your body.
All right. So let's say you are in ketosis and you eat just enough, calories with the proper ratios, fat, protein, scant carbs, the ketogenic diet. You eat just enough calories to burn, all right? Nothing else gets burned. Great. You're at equilibrium. Everything's cool. Nothing gets stored. Great.
That's right.
What happens if you eat more calories? Now, let's say those calories are from fat. Let's say we eat another 1,000 calories or 500 calories of fat. Is it like carbohydrates that when there's too much of the fuel, the other stuff gets stored? Does that get stored as fat, or is it just sort of slowly burned off? In your sleep or whatever?
No, there's a limit to how much you can carry in your blood. You only have 5 liters of blood running around your body. Mm-hmm. So there's only a limit to how much. You can't have too much of a concentration of anything in your blood. It likes to have levels of everything. So what will happen is your fat cells will store that extra 1,000 calories. So it is quite possible on a ketogenic diet, if you eat too many calories, that you will put on weight. And if you eat less calories than you burn, then you will lose weight. The trick about the ketogenic diet is, or one of the tricks about the ketogenic diet, is that you get satiated a lot quicker because you have access to stored body fat. So where somebody is eating carbs, when their blood sugars go low, they have to go find a candy bar. They need a candy bar stat, whereas if somebody is well positioned to be able to burn body fat, then when their blood sugar goes a little bit low, they have access to energy. They have access to energy reserves that they could use.
Yeah, and the overeating thing is key because when you're eating carbohydrates or too much, you're not in ketosis, let's say, on the carbohydrate metabolism, let's call it that. On the carbohydrate metabolism, if when you eat carbs, the higher insulin levels prohibit that leptin receptor that tells your brain you're full. And this is unnatural, folks. This is not normal, healthy eating. Being in ketosis is really it's the original metabolic state of our bodies. It has to be.
We're all born in ketosis.
Yeah, we're all born in ketosis, right? So this is a more natural state. And when you have had enough, you don't want to eat anymore. You feel, like I said before, I feel nauseated if I eat too much.
Yes.
And that's the proper signal, isn't it?
Had you ever felt that before?
No.
Before doing a ketogenic diet?
Not unless I was in ketosis, no. So technically, Richard, what is fat?
Technically, fat is something called a triglyceride.
All right.
And basically, it's 3 fatty acids that are joined by a glycerol. And fatty acids can be monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, or saturated fatty acids. Okay. And most fats are a combination of all 3. For example, lard is 50% monounsaturated fatty acid. And for example, oleic acid is a fatty acid in olive oil. That's where the oleic name comes from. Lard, of course, is pig fat, but 50% of lard is monounsaturated fatty acid. Everybody calls that, the monounsaturates, the good fats.
Yeah, the good fats.
Yeah, so the vegans call them the good fats. Everybody agrees that these are good fats.
Avocados are in that category.
Avocados in that category. So not everybody agrees on the other fatty acids, but certainly for the monounsaturates, everybody's happy with those.
The polyunsaturated, what about those? Those sort of are in the middle.
Okay, so lard is 50% monounsaturated, it's 10% polyunsaturated, and 40% saturated fatty acids. And the polyunsaturates have got multiple double bonds, and basically they can be either omega-3, omega-6, omega-9, omega-7, and it really depends on where the first double bond appears is how they get categorized.
Now, scientifically, for most people, those are just names. But what do they mean? And do we need to know? Do we even need to know what they mean?
Yeah, they're actually probably the most critical thing to know about fats, the most critical health issue, because the polyunsaturated fats that we eat eventually go to make the outside of all of our cells. All of our cells are sheathed with polyunsaturated fatty acids that we've eaten at some point. Now, the omega-3s are known as anti-inflammatory. That is, you understand the process of inflammation. You have an injury, or a part of your body gets scratched or something, and it swells up, it gets red, and it gets inflamed. This is all a natural process. There's basically two processes. Omega-3s contribute to reducing inflammation, and omega-6s contribute to increasing inflammation. And we want to balance. And so it's important from a dietary point of view to balance these two off against each other.
What are some examples of omega-6?
Seed oils, for example. Canola oil is a omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. A good example of a omega-3 would be cod liver oil.
Or fish oil in general.
Fish oil, or the only plant one that I know of is flax oil. Any fish that lives on deep sea plankton, omega-3 actually comes from the plankton. It's all made by the plankton, and the fish is just eating the plankton. And then
so you can, if you don't eat flax and you don't eat a lot of fatty fish, the best thing to do is take a supplement, right?
I actually do. I take a krill oil supplement every day for omega-3s, and I try and limit the amount of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats in my diet so that I have close to a one-to-one relationship. If you actually have a look at the modern diet that most of us eat, it's like 60 to 1. 60 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. And this is because our diet is so full of seed oils.
Now, why? Why is that? Is it because processed foods use a lot of seed oils?
Yeah, it's also very cheap.
Yeah. One of the staples of the ketogenic diet, at least where flours are concerned, is almond meal, right?
Right.
So almond is a nut.
Yeah.
And is that an omega-6 fat that's in almond meal?
It is an omega-6 fat, that's right. And as are macadamias and almonds, there is omega-6 oils in all of those. Wow. So it's important. It's important to counterbalance those with a little bit of fish oil. I mean, unless you have a lot of fish oil in your diet.
Right. That's really good to know because, people on the keto diet, we don't have processed food. I mean, I haven't eaten any processed food in months, but but I cook with olive oil. I cook with butter. That's a saturated fat, but we'll talk about that next. But I try to limit my exposure to nuts because I know that they're good carbohydrates to have, just as snacks and things. And I also take the fish oil supplements. So, all right, let's talk about butter. Butter is something that I eat a lot of.
Yeah, butter is actually mostly saturated fat. We learned early on that people who have heart attacks have a lot of saturated fat in their blood. And we jumped to the conclusion that people who have saturated fat in their blood got that way from eating it.
Yeah.
And therefore, butter must be bad and lard must be bad because, 40% of lard is saturated fat. And so we jumped to this conclusion. We did the same thing with cholesterol as well, right? We said, well, people who have heart attacks have a high level of certain types of cholesterol in their blood, therefore don't eat any cholesterol. And it turns out that the liver makes most of your cholesterol. Very few people actually get cholesterol in their blood from cholesterol that they ate.
So let's say this. If you're in ketosis, saturated fat affects you a lot differently than if you're not in ketosis.
That's exactly right.
If you're not in ketosis, you eat fat, saturated fat, it's going to get stored, as we said before. Your liver, therefore, is going to pump more fat into your bloodstream from the sugar. And if you are in ketosis, however, that is just another fat source.
Yes. So one of the interesting things about saturated fat is the more that you eat, the less you have in your blood.
Yeah.
And the more carbs you eat, the more saturated fat you have in your blood. And the reason for this is when you're in ketosis, you've trained your body to burn fat. All of your cells are burning fat. The first fat that they burn is apparently saturated fat. So they draw all that down first.
Huh.
And so what's left in your body is all of the non-saturated fats. So they're left in your blood, and then it gets to those next. So this is why somebody who is a fat burner and their cells are predominantly burning fat has lower saturated fat.
That is so contradictory to the conventional wisdom that everybody seems to have, because we haven't been in ketosis for our whole lives. We haven't been in ketosis, and we should have been.
It's a very metabolically advantaged state to be in, yes.
So good fats, bad fats, we hope we've cleared up some of that mystery now. The whole key is the amount of carbs that you're eating. If you're in ketosis, you're eating less than 20 grams of carbs a day. Fat is your primary fuel source. It does not go into your bloodstream. It reduces the fat in your bloodstream. So therefore, just be careful of those omega-6 oils, which you have to balance out with fatty fish or fish oil.
Yeah. A lot of people literally religiously, eat fish once a week. And that's actually a good habit to get into. As is fasting, which is another tradition from religious observances. So fasting is another important way to regulate your metabolism, and we'll do a whole show on fasting at some point.
Yeah, right. And here's the other thing about fish, though. You may be worried about it because our waters are so damaged and polluted that there's a lot of poison in the fish, a lot more lead than we actually thought is in fish.
Yeah.
Is there any way to test it? Is there any testing thing you can get to take a piece of fish and find out, oh, this has too much lead in it? And no amount of lead is enough or safe. But, other heavy metals like mercury is very commonly found in fish.
All of the heavy metals will, and it's because the fish are pretty much on the top of their food chain. And so they're eating things that eat plankton that's picking up all of these heavy metals from the bottom of the lakes and rivers and the ocean. So there are food labs that you can send samples of food to be assayed. I've gone through looking at the process, and it's like $200 or $300 per sample, and so it's not economically viable for us.
That's absolutely not viable, yeah. So you can't just buy some fish from the grocer and say, hang on, I'm going to just put this in my fridge for a couple weeks until my $200 sample comes back, and then I'll think about eating it. You can't do that.
That would be unrealistic.
So what is one to do about that?
Have a good relationship with your fishmonger. In Australia, and I know it was slightly different when I lived in America, but in Australia, we import a lot of frozen fish from Vietnam and Thailand and other areas in Southeast Asia. And if the fishmonger doesn't know you and you go and ask for some fish, he'll probably sell you some frozen stuff that he's thawed out in his front counter. But if you know him and you build up a relationship and you say, what's good eating today, he can identify a fish that was caught locally or that was...
But he doesn't know the mercury content of his fish any more than you do when you buy it, does he?
No.
Well, I won't belabor that, but, there is no way to be careful except to not eat it. And so, there you go. Take that away and do what you want with it. All right, you have a book that you want to talk about.
This show is The Big Fat Show, and we named it that after a book called The Big Fat Surprise, which was a book written by Nina Teicholz. We'll include a link to a really interesting video of her presentation during her book launch. She did a presentation to the Commonwealth Club, and she did an interview post-presentation with Jack Krause. So it's an interesting explanation of how we got so messed up when it comes to fats.
I watched that and I thought it was brilliant.
Oh, it's outstanding. As I mentioned before, there was an observation that people who have heart attacks and diabetes have a lot of saturated fat in the blood. And it all comes back to this guy, Ansel Keys, again. Because in the 70s, he came up with this concept, well, actually the 60s, he came up with this concept called the diet heart hypothesis. And the hypothesis was that people who eat lots of saturated fat and lots of cholesterol end up with lots of heart attacks. And he was able to see these things in the blood, and that was the nature of his hypothesis. But he sold it to everybody using an analogy, a plumbing analogy, which doesn't really make a lot of sense when you think about it. And you've probably heard this before, that saturated fats clog your arteries and they give you heart disease like bacon grease clogs your sink.
Yeah.
But of course, our bodies run at a higher temperature than room temperature. And it's not an issue of fats solidifying in your veins. But it was an easy metaphor for people to understand. And so he did this 7-country study, which you mentioned in the first show. And he was looking for a correlation between, and he found in his 7 countries a correlation between low consumption of saturated fat and low risk of heart attacks. But Nina Teicholz explains it much better than I do. But basically, he cherry-picked all of the countries that would support his hypothesis, like Crete and Greece and Italy, and ignored all of the countries that have a high saturated fat diet and have low incidence of heart disease, like France, Switzerland, and Germany. All these places eat a lot of cheese. They don't have a lot of heart attacks. And
also the Inuit and the Maasai were another 2 that he completely missed.
Exactly. So he was very selective. He took 13,000 food surveys to try and find out what people ate. But his data was so bad that he threw away all but about 500 of them. So it was a very small, unreliable sample of his data.
Right.
And he also, one of his standout areas that basically they loved and they kept going back to was Crete, where they found that people were very long-lived and yet had a very low saturated fat diet during the time when they did their assay. Turns out they were actually testing these people during Lent, and they were all giving up meat and fatty foods for Lent. So they got an unrealistic representation of what these people ate. Go forward about to 1977, and there was a Senate committee set up by McGovern, who the outcome of this committee was to review all of the data and come up with a plan for America. And Senator McGovern famously said, "We don't have the luxury of time to wait until we have all the evidence." And they came up with a solution, which was that a low-fat diet restricting meat and dairy products should be recommended for all Americans over the age of 2. And they turned this into the food pyramid. In 1980, the USDA suggested to replace dietary fat with healthy, quote-unquote, air quotes, healthy carbohydrates. And we ended up with the food pyramid, and pretty much that gave us all diabetes. So long story short.
So, Richard, there's one thing in the news that caught my eye this week, which is February 15th, this study paper was published about a study, and this was in your neck of the woods, actually. It was in Melbourne.
Yeah.
University of Melbourne.
Yeah, I know of this study. This is Sof Andrikopoulos, and he was in all the press, and he was talking about how the paleo diet causes diabetes.
Right.
That was his bottom line, and that's what the press all picked up on.
So the title of the paper is "A Low Carbohydrate, High Fat Diet Increases Weight Gain and Does Not Improve Glucose Tolerance, Insulin Secretion, or beta cell mass in NZO mice." That means New Zealand in origin, right?
New Zealand obesogenic mice, yeah. The New Zealand mice have stuffed us up again.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of interesting things here. Those mice are bred specifically to get fat. They're the New Zealand obesogenic mice. They have a problem in their DNA where they don't tolerate well calories. They just eat and don't stop eating, and they become fat.
And so that has nothing to do with the carbohydrates that they are eating? That doesn't matter if they're eating?
Has nothing to do with the food.
We looked at the chow that they were given, the low carbohydrate, high fat diet, and we're going to publish links to the study, which has links to the papers that have the chow ingredients here.
Sure.
And let's talk about what this chow is. 400 grams per kilogram of it is cocoa butter. So 40%, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
20% of it is casein.
That's a milk protein, yeah.
Milk protein. 10% of it is sucrose. Now that's sugar. 10% of what they were fed was pure sugar. Another 10% canola oil, which, as you know, is an omega-6 fat.
Yes.
10% was clarified butter.
Yeah.
5% cellulose, and then we have traces of calcium carbonate, vitamin.
All the essential nutrients, essential micronutrients.
Exactly.
So what they're being fed there is essentially white chocolate. If you take, basically white chocolate is cocoa butter, sugar, and milk. There's a little bit of clarified butter is your milk fat, your casein is your milk protein, you've got sucrose in there. So it's basically a low sugar version of milk added to cocoa butter and sugar.
Yeah.
And it was these mice, they were ad libitum, which basically means the mice were allowed to eat as much of this white chocolate as they wanted. And they're mice who are specifically bred to not stop eating. They're little porkers, and they'll just pile it on. And the other interesting thing about this is that in a low-carb metabolism, mice behave differently than humans. There was a paper done by Richard Feynman who identified that these mice identified all the differences between how a human behaves when they have a low-carb diet and a mouse behaves. So you can't actually really use any mice as a model for this particular kind of thing. You really have to use humans. And this particular mouse is even worse. So it looks like this entire study was designed to produce the outcome that it got.
And you have sort of a history with the Diabetes Association in Australia. You're always arguing with these guys. They seem to have an agenda that promotes a low-fat, high carbohydrate diet for diabetics.
Yeah, they do. I remember I've still got the material that I was given when I was first diagnosed as diabetic, and this sample diet that they wanted me to go on was extremely high carbohydrate. It's a low fat diet. It was probably going to lower my weight at the cost of large glucose excursions, and high glucose is where you get all of the problems for diabetes. Yeah. So, I'm happy that I was able to find something that was able to keep my glucose under control. But that diet that I was given as part of my initiation to having type 2 diabetes wouldn't have done that.
I was at a bookstore, which, you would think that books on nutrition in a bookstore are authoritative. And I found this diabetic cookbook for type 2 diabetes. And I pulled it off the shelf and I just started looking through the recipes and stuff. And they're all low-fat, high-sugar recipes. What on earth compels people to think that this is going to work for them?
Yeah. Diabetes for Dummies. There's a recipe in there that it's an 8 servings recipe that one of its ingredients is half a pound of sugar. So the theory is that I'll give you the explanation for why these very good and very clever people and well-intentioned people are doing something extremely evil. Their hypothesis is most of the people who have type 2 diabetes are overweight. And they tend to get overweight first, and then a little bit later their blood sugars rise and they start getting all of the problems of diabetes. And the assumption is that because they were overweight first and then they got high blood sugar second, that being overweight causes high blood sugar. So the focus for diabetes is to try and get people's weight off.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The problem, as we mentioned last week on the insulin show, Dr. Kraft found out that 10 years before somebody's blood sugar starts to go up, they're already hyperproducing insulin. And so well before they're actually putting on weight, they've got this problem with their insulin mechanism. That hyperinsulinemia, that causes both being overweight and the high blood sugar. I've spoken to diabetes educators in both America and Australia, and they've both tried to sell me on high carbohydrate, low fat diets. Their focus is on dropping people's weight because their theory is the weight causes diabetes, but in fact, they're both two symptoms of the same problem. And you need to get people's insulin down, and the only way to do that is to stop them eating things that make their insulin to go up, which is basically carbohydrates and protein. So we have to have some protein. We have to have just enough to maintain our body. Any beyond that is unnecessary or is surplus to requirements. So we get all of our energy from fat because fat doesn't increase insulin.
All right. I think it's recipe time. Recipes. All right, I'm going to go first this time.
Yeah, sure.
I actually found this recipe from a friend of ours, Brenda Zorn.
One of the keto ninjas.
Yeah, one of the keto ninjas. And she basically says this is a staple among ketoers everywhere.
Okay.
It's Fathead pizza.
Ah.
Now, Fathead is a blog or a movie, I guess, right?
It was a movie, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
The subtitle is You've Been Fed a Load of Baloney.
Yeah.
So basically what came out of this is the older brother's oldest son's faux carb pizza.
Okay.
And then we say faux carb because it's a pizza that is made with some almond meal. The crust is. But let me tell you something. It is pizza.
It tastes like pizza?
It is pizza.
Nice.
Yeah, so I went over to our friend's house. You know who I'm talking about, the MMs.
Yeah.
I went over to their house. They're both doing keto. And I said, hey, how about pizza? And they're like, pizza?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll provide the link, but here's the crust. It's 1.5 cups of shredded mozzarella, 3/4 of a cup of almond flour, 2 tablespoons of cream cheese, which is essentially 1 ounce, 1 egg, a little garlic salt, and you're going to need parchment paper and a cookie sheet.
Right.
Put the mozzarella in the cream cheese, which is cut up into small chunks, in a microwave-safe bowl, and you microwave for 1 minute. And then you stir it, and then another 30 seconds.
So that's going to melt it a little bit, right?
Yeah, it melts the cheese. And you know when mozzarella melts, it gets all stringy?
Oh, yeah.
You ever notice that quality in pizza dough?
Yes, actually it does, yeah.
Those
so
are
it's
the
got that stretchiness.
protein chains that are stretching. It's the same stuff. All right, so then you want to take it out. So you've done it for a minute, stirred it, another 30 seconds on high. Then you put in the egg and the almond flour, and you stir it, and you stir it, and you stir it, and you stir it, and it has that consistency of dough. It's stretchy. It's hard to incorporate the egg in there. Just take a fork and just keep beating it in and beating it in and beating it in. It's all right if there are little blotches of cream cheese in there. No problem. So then you basically plop it down on parchment paper, and you just spread it out with a couple of big spoons, or you can use your hands. You might want to wet your hands.
So you don't need to aerate it, turn it to a foam or anything like that, which you'd expect from a dough.
But here's the thing. It's a thin crust pizza, so it's going to be crispy.
Ah, of course.
It's not going to rise.
And cheesy, too.
And
it's going to be
cheesy.
like a cheesy crispy pizza.
Yeah.
They're the best kind.
All right, so once you've spread it out as thin as it can go without, completely air, right? You want to poke holes with a knife or a fork in it. So that's called docking.
Docking, yeah.
Sprinkle a little garlic salt over it. 425-degree Fahrenheit oven.
That'd be around about 220 Celsius.
All right. So put that in for 8 minutes. 8 minutes, pull it out, and you're going to see some bubbles, and you're going to see just a little touch of browning. Again, take a knife or a fork and bam those bubbles down. Maybe you like bubbles. I don't know. But the problem with bubbles is that they tend to brown really fast because they're a lot thinner.
They're thin, yeah.
So pound them down, put it back in for another 4 to 6 minutes or until brown on top. And it looks delicious right now. Now, any toppings that you put on this should be fully cooked already.
Right. So you're not going to cook them on the pizza.
No.
You're just going to melt the cheese and that's it.
Right. So you want to put maybe crumbled sausage, Maybe you want some mushrooms that you sauteed.
Some chorizo.
Yeah. Some pepperoni. Now, pepperoni, I would crisp those up in a pan as well.
Yeah.
Maybe you want some herbs like some fresh basil, some fresh oregano, that kind of stuff. Maybe you want a little Parmesan on there.
Yeah.
And of course, mozzarella.
Yeah.
Now, before you put it back in the oven, turn the broiler on.
Okay.
Turn it on broil. Because that's going to bring the heat down from the top instead of up from the bottom. Now, the crust is already crispy. So now you want heat from the top to melt the cheese and brown whatever's on there.
In Australia, we call that a griller.
Yeah.
So it's the griller function of an oven, yeah, not a broil.
Sauce, right? Because I know everybody likes sauce.
Yeah.
I would be careful about tomato sauce.
Yeah, tomatoes got some sugar in them, yeah.
You make your own tomato sauce, don't you? And I've done it myself.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of tomatoes, though.
It does.
You basically have to put them all through a sieve and get out all the...
Yeah, I don't do that. I leave the seeds. I leave the fiber in there.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, there's a low-carb sauce out there called Rao's, R-A-O''S. And for a half a cup, you have like 4 net grams of carbs, but it's all sugar. That's the problem. They're sugar carbs. They're not fiber carbs. So what I did was I did not use sauce. I put down garlic and olive oil, and I just sort of sprinkled that around.
Yeah, I use the back of a spoon when I make pizzas to spread the olive oil, yeah. Yep,
olive oil, crushed garlic. Then I put on feta cheese, Greek cheese. That's wonderful. And sausage. And then mozzarella. And then sauteed spinach on the top of the mozzarella, and then sprinkled some basil and oregano on that. And let me tell you something, that is just amazing.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
I really actually thought that I would, after a couple of months, go to New Haven, Connecticut, to Pepe's Pizza, which is the best pizza in the world, by the way.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, even our friend Richard Campbell, who has been all over the world and has had the best pizza, okay, Richard, what do you think? This is the best pizza I've ever had in my life.
Okay, awesome.
So, Pepe's. Anyway, so I thought I would have to go to Pepe's because the urge would be too great. But after having this, I don't need to. It's so good. Crispy crust. You can hold it. You can pick it up.
Nice.
And eat it New York style.
Nice.
And you're full after a couple of pieces. That's the best part.
How wonderful is that? Yeah, because it's full of fat. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's my recipe. What do you got?
Awesome. Well, I'm going to do. I've actually been smoking meat today. I got a.
You shouldn't smoke meat. It's bad for your lungs.
It is. Boom, boom. So today I've been smoking. As I said, I've been smoking meat, and I actually I smoked some lamb shoulder. Now, the recipe I'm doing is pulled lamb, and you don't need a smoker. You don't need a fancy smoker to get flavour in. I just use a smoker because it's an easy way to get flavour through the top sort of centimetre of the meat surface.
Right. Sure.
What you can do is you can rub the meat beforehand, and you make a wet rub using a little bit of oil, some salt, and your favourite herbs and spices. And then you put it in a slow cooker. And you put it in with a bay leaf and a little bit of water. I actually use, sometimes I use whey left over for making cheese or chicken stock or what have you. You basically put it in a slow cooker. And the point of having a little bit of water in the bottom is you're trying to stop the meat from catching until there's been enough time for some of the fats to render out of the meat and to provide some lubrication. And then you basically cook the meat in a slow cooker. Basically until the meat's falling off the bone.
Wow, nice.
And normally it takes about 6 hours. The reason I use a shoulder joint is that it's one of the fattiest parts of the beast. And in the case of lamb, it's not normally trimmed out much, so you end up with a lot of the fat left there.
Now, why would you use a slow cooker as opposed to a pressure cooker?
So you can use a pressure cooker, but the reason why I use a slow cooker is because the shoulder's a large joint and doesn't fit in my pressure cooker.
Yeah.
But also, the thing about the pressure cooker is you put the lid on and you set it going. You can't sort of go in and taste it and see where it's at. You need to dial down the pressure and undo it all before you have a look at it. And so it's a little bit less precise. Today I smoked a beef shoulder, a pork shoulder, and yesterday I did a goat shoulder and a lamb shoulder, and each of them is going to spend some time in the slow cooker. So the trick that I do is once I've got the meat so that it's falling off the bone, I get a couple of forks, a fork in each hand, and I start shredding it all up. And once I've shredded it all up, I portion the meat into. I basically put a large cup on a scale, and I put a freezer bag inside the cup, and I fill the cup with shredded meat until I get about 200 grams. Now, 200 grams for Julie and I is a meal for each of us. So I'm basically taking portioning of the meat. I then roll it up, and you'll see on my blog how I did this, but I roll them up and freeze them. And this weekend, I've spent time basically preparing 10 kilos worth of meat. That's going to last me for about 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And then when you need to use this, you've got a bag in the freezer with 200 grams of pulled meat that's frozen solid. Drop that freezer bag into some warm water. It'll thaw out. Chuck it in a pan, put a bit of fat in the pan, maybe some tomato puree or a couple of herbs in there, and in about 2 or 3 minutes, you've got a well-cooked meal. And you know the meat's been well-cooked and the flavours throughout the meat, and it's
right.
It's a very quick way, a very convenient way of getting a meal on a plate.
Wow, that sounds delicious.
Oh, it is. It is.
I'm going to have to try it. Well, Richard, that's a show. I love doing these shows with you. This is so much fun.
Yeah, they're great.
And we encourage your feedback. If you want to email us, it's dudes@2ketodudes.com.
Dude, we've got an email address.
We do. We're on iTunes. We have arrived, my friend.
We're here. So what's that address again?
Dudes@2ketodudes.com. That's the number 2. And ketodudes.com. And of course, go to 2ketodudes.com and we have comments there. You could comment on your phone, of course. But go to the website or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
And look on all our show notes. We've got references from each of our shows and pictures of our recipes that we've got. So
right. And lots of science, as Richard said. You could lose yourself in the science if you really want to. We'll see you next time on 2 Keto Dudes.